Hello, good evening. Saturday night, therefore I think it's time for a bit more of the enormous book, Holy Book of Thoth by Vladimir Shmakov. This time I'm going to read a portion from Arcanum 8. Justice, that's the image he's using. And the artist Mascutin. And this is the tarot deck I use with this, the Art Theurg tarot deck. That's his lovely Justice image. So as I've mentioned before, the book is massive. Just reading out the Arcanum in huge chunks I don't think really works, because I think it's just too much information. So as I've started doing with the others, I'm just going to pick a section of this Arcanum which I think would be most interesting to share. This being Metempsychosis, transmigration of souls. Now it is notable that these Russian occult teachers, even those who, like Valentin Tomberg, became devout Catholic and part of the exoteric religion, as they were the esoteric, did retain a belief in reincarnation, as is common amongst occultists anyway. Shmakov was no exception, and those of you who've been able to obtain and read the book may know, if you've got to the afterword, that Shmakov did hint at one of his own past lives, speaking of somebody called Ben Alaman. I'm not sure if I can find the section on Ben Alaman. I don't think we're supposed to know who Ben Alaman is, but he was, we think, here we go, page 506, when we're talking about the diaries and papers which Victor, the mysterious Victor, who's given his own history of Shmakov and his search for the philosophical machine that is the tarot. Whilst looking through the private papers, he found a typed document which began with the mysterious words, "Ben Alaman fell asleep." Now Victor recalled the beginning of this document in Shmakov's diary. Ben Alaman fell asleep. At this very time, the first cry of the newborn was heard. A boy was born who was named Vladimir. Shmakov. All his life, he expected, or was afraid, that Ben Alaman would wake up and incarnate. And so, in a distant country, among a noisy feast in the circle of relatives and friends, being in the prime of his years, he suddenly fell lifeless. Ben Alaman woke up. Do we take it from this that the awakening of Ben Alaman marked the beginning of Shmakov's occult life? Bearing in mind that in his short life, and in a very short space of time before he left Russia, in I think between, I would say, 1916 and 1922, Shmakov produced, not just the Holy Book of Thoth, but pneumatology, thousands of pages, absolutely enormous accomplishments. Where was all this coming from? He was a very young man. Even just reading all the books and texts that he cites could take a lifetime. Did this knowledge come from Ben Alaman? Okay. Anyway, we don't know who he is. So what does he have to teach about metempsychosis? The totality of laws and principles that speak directly about the life and activity of the human being is naturally the cornerstone of all philosophical and religious systems. Man lives in himself, knows in himself, moves in himself. Bound by the sight of his consciousness, he knows everything only through the prism of his being, feels only his connection with the outside. Relying on his Atman as an absolute principle for him, man divides everything that lies outside into two opposite mottos. That which is connected with his consciousness through his very spirit is the world of spirit, synthesized in the concept of God. That which is known by consciousness in the totality of all a priori possible states of it in the aspect of the individual spirit, synthesized in the concept of the phenomenal nature. Having a sense of reality, the human genius ascends by means of transcendental constructions, both over the individuality of the Atman itself and over the individuality of the modes of consciousness inherent in it. In the first case, a person approaches cosmogony, that is, the classification of realities according to their inherent consciousness, and objectifies them into a consistent chain of modes of absolute reality. And in the second case, he creates anthropogeny, that is, the doctrine of the relationship between the states of consciousness of the Atman and the cosmic environment. For this reason, the supreme synthetic science is divided into two divisions: the doctrine of the relationship between God and man, and the doctrine of the relationship between man and the universe. The cycle of the first 7 arcana, the teaching of the great Septerna, is a cosmogony. So that would be the magician, the high priestess, the empress, the emperor, the Hierophant, the lovers, and the chariot. The first Septerna is a cosmogony. Arcanum 8 begins the doctrine of anthropogeny, since it proclaims the basic laws of human existence which determine in a synthetic form the entire appearance of man. He gives a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, Book 8. I am the unharmed and supreme Brahma, in the inner nature, Adhyatma. I am the supreme spirit, the soul of all souls in the world, and that which flows out of me, the cause of all existences in the world, is karma. The doctrine of metempsychosis, the laws of karma, essentially exhausts all the teaching about man. Using the systematics of the Book of Hermes, we will divide it into a number of separate questions, and here we will give only their general synthetic basis. What is stated about Atman, the elements of composition, consciousness, and pulsation, can be summarized by the following law. The human Atman, or the true absolute ego, can, using the pulsation of its consciousness, combine it with one or with an arbitrary number of elements in arbitrary combinations, and, by combining their inherent consciousness into a total whole, thereby objectify in itself a relative ego that receives an independent being in its inherent consciousness. A separate human life, in relation to a whole person, is a way of fulfilling a specific system of tasks that should ultimately give their own relative synthesis. Individual incarnations of a person are based on the method of conscious ignorance and the concrete selection of a certain set of elements in certain keys by the absolute ego from the general composition, hitherto existing only potentially. Like each individual act, which requires the full concentration of all forces for its execution, a separate life is a temporary limitation of a person's whole being and his capabilities, and a complete concentration within this framework of all the power of the active will. Human consciousness is projected into the outside. It breaks the connection with its general composition, the totality of elements already approved earlier, and completely enters the narrow limits set by the power of the higher self. At different moments in his life, a person experiences different thoughts, feelings, and moods. Thanks to him, he even feels completely different. Thanks to these. Nevertheless, If he discards the form more and more and passes into the essence of his thoughts, experiences, and moods, he can always eventually come to the consciousness of the complete immutability and permanence of his inner basis. This essence of his being is the relative ego. The relative ego is an aspect of the ego of the Absolute, and therefore, generally speaking, its limits are relative, because it can, when combined with other aspects, become more complex and, as it were, increase, and vice versa. One absolute ego can produce an arbitrary number of relative egos, arbitrarily different from each other. The incarnation is that turning point when the chosen relative ego is fixed, as it were, until the very end of the incarnation, and on its way it can no longer change according to the very essence of the concepts of the incarnation. This is expressed by the law. The absolute ego can give rise to an arbitrary number of relative egos. The incarnation is the fixation of one of them, and therefore on the path of each incarnation, the ego remains permanent. That's my email, which I never turn off. He then quotes from Ecclesiastes. What exists is already named, and it is known that it is a man, and that he cannot quarrel with someone who is stronger than him. Along with the above, living in itself and working in the sphere of its own tasks and capabilities, the human being on the path of a particular incarnation is not irrevocably separated from the rest of the world. Each part, in addition to being in itself, is also a component of the whole and tends to it. That is why man, living in himself, at the same time lives in the realm of the infinite, and, fulfilling his mission, fulfills at the same time the universal mission, the Tikkun Olam. He quotes now from Eliphas Levi. God works through his creatures. In heaven he works through angels, on earth through men. The fall of Adam is a conscious separation of consciousness from the world of pure spirit and its transition to the phenomenal world for a complete and exhaustive self-affirmation in all its potentially inherent keys. A separate phenomenal existence is only a single stage, a partial fulfillment of a common goal. Natura non amat saltus. Both the projection into the phenomenal world and the affirmation in it cannot take place except gradually. On the other hand, the antinomian nature of all phenomenal manifestations generally eliminates the possibility of the simultaneous development of opposite properties. Finally, the fullness and perfection of the affirmation of the totality of the tonalities of each aspect of the Atman can only be achieved by doing so from all angles and in particular states of consciousness. This leads us to recognize a priori the necessity of the existence of the following law. The self-affirmation of the Atman in its inherent potentials is accomplished by the successive affirmation in the chain of individual particular complexes of elements, that is, by the successive realization of all relative egos in the amount necessary for the full and harmonious self-consciousness of the Atman. As Isaac Luria says, and since Adam's sin mixed good with evil, we are doomed to perform numerous reincarnations until we are restored. The development of this law is the theory of metempsychosis. It is based on the law of causal sequence. The self-affirmation of reality goes in reverse order against the identification of sequence. The self-affirmation of reality goes in reverse order against the identification of potential modes of consciousness. It begins at the final edge of the identification, that is, in binaries of the ultimate, differentially small order. Further approval follows the order of gradually increasing synthesis according to the law of recurrent pulsation, and each new increment to the mass of what has already been approved follows from it by virtue of a reasonable obligation. I'm going to read that again. The development of this law is the theory of metempsychosis. It is based on the law of causal sequence. The self-affirmation of reality goes in reverse order against the identification of potential modes of consciousness, self-consciousness. It begins at the final edge of the identification, that is, in binaries of the ultimate, differentially small order. Further approval follows the order of gradually increasing synthesis according to the laws of recurrent pulsation, and each new increment to the mass of what has already been approved follows from it by virtue of a reasonable obligation. Quoting again from Isaac Luria, since evil was mixed with good, two things have become necessary. 1. It is the duty of man to separate the good from the evil. And 2. It is the duty to restore the good part in the synthesis. Now, there's a quote from Rumi. I died as a mineral and became a plant. I died as a plant and reappeared as an animal. I died as an animal and became a man. Why should I be afraid? Did death stop my growth? Next time I'll die as a human, so that I can grow angel wings. And I have to get ahead of the angels too, for all will perish except his face. I must rise above the angels. I will become something beyond the imagination. And then may I become nothing, for the harp string, it sings in me. Surely we will return to him. And now Schopenhauer. After a long period of unconscious and semi-conscious existence in the mineral, vegetable and animal kingdom, nature in man reaches its highest development and asks itself, what am I? Man is the organ of self-consciousness of nature. And now a quote from Inayat Khan. Nature, through spirit, condenses into matter, and then flows out again, passing through various stages. Man is really the result of the involution of spirit, as well as of the evolution of matter. And in the final result of this, he is nothing but self-realization, which means that the knower attains a degree of perfection at which he can know himself. The connection between cause and effect can only be reached by the consciousness that embraces both. Because of this, in each individual incarnation, a person, knowing only the present, which is a consequence of the preceding, a priori cannot, generally speaking, be aware of this connection. An exception to this situation can only be in the case where a person can somehow, by intuition, ascend beyond the limits of his relative ego, which is characteristic of this incarnation. In this way, he can gain knowledge of the past or reveal the future's due. But still, this very possibility is limited and in most cases completely closed. And is it a past life remembrance or an overshadowing by a spirit or an archetype? He's now going to quote from the Zohar. All souls are subject to the changes of transmigration, metempsychosis, and people do not know what the ways of the Most High are in relation to them. They do not know how they were judged at all times, how before they came to this world and after they left it, they do not know how many transformations and mysterious changes they are obliged to undergo. How many souls and spirits come to this world thrown by a sling. The souls must return to the absolute substance from which they came. But to do this, they must develop all the perfections that the seed of which lies in them. And if they have not accomplished this in one lifetime, then they must begin again the second, third, etc., until they reach the state in which reunion with God becomes possible. The so-called question of the immortality of the individual is directly related to the above. The personality of a person in a separate incarnation, that is, the full consciousness of the relative ego inherent in him, is a certain set of elements, in which two elements take place. Aspects of reality as such and their phenomenal interpretation. Using this division, we can express the solution to this problem in two laws. The totality of the elements corresponding to a particular absolute ego is definite and fixed only in relation to a given incarnation. With its completion, the full composition, the sum of all karmic experience, is regrouped. At the same time, the elements quite harmoniously revealed pass into the general composition and into the divine soul, being imprinted in the pentagram of man. And the other part, together with the others or without them, again forms the relative ego, which should be established in the next incarnation. Thus the personality of man is always mortal to the earth, but in relation to the being of the true man, it is immortal insofar as it is harmonious. Now, I don't know if you watched the last video from the seventh Arcanum, the Chariot, where we spoke about the Ea doctrine and the Leia doctrine, whereby the process of fall, the elements of the being are channeled through these ear centres, through the different spheres of being, or if you like, internally the chakra system. And so when we come to make the path of return, when we manage to achieve another layer, another step in this hierarchy on the way back, we then reconnect with the sealed essential material that did not get lost in the fall. So the most perfected and divine parts of the human being, of the soul, are sealed and not lost. Our task, therefore, is to reconnect with them and keep going until we manage to get back. Now, of course, it's still possible to slide back down. It's, a great horror of occultism, backsliding. The one thing we're not supposed to do, just like backpacking, don't backtrack, don't go back. In practice, as it happens, most people stumble and fall back. Okay, it happens. So, but, take courage and heart from the fact that the essential elements are sealed, and that's been partly through the journey through the ear centres, the filtering system. Okay, so anyway, as Philo says, man is at the borderline of death and immortality. From Brahman Chatterjee, everything so far as it is a form is destroyed. So far as it is a force or a life, it will continue to exist. The performance of a particular task, the statement in a certain set of elements, in some cases can be carried out through the experience of another person, vicariously. Identifying with the incarnate soul, dissolving it completely, the higher soul also participates in all its actions and perceives the results of them, as if it has taken possession of this lower soul and would itself directly carry out its life and activities. That's the overshadowing, I think, was talking about. Back to Isaac Luria, The incarnation is called Gilgul. So Gilgul Neshamot is a Kabbalistic concept of reincarnation. The Hebrew word Gilgul means a cycle or a wheel, and Neshamot is the plural for souls. Okay. The incarnation, called Gilgul, is the case when a child leaves the womb of its mother, a certain soul enters it. This soul is obliged to bear all the suffering and all the misfortunes that will befall this body and by which it enters the arena of the world until its death, without being able to separate from it before its last day. The indwelling, or ibur, is the case when the soul comes into the world through a person already born in this world and completely independent. Just seeing if I've said anything else about this. I'll just read a bit more of my explanation of Lyria's terms here. So Gilgul, souls. Souls are seen to cycle through the incarnations, attaching to different human bodies over time, depending on the spiritual development, predecessors and world missions. It relates to the messianic rectification, tikkun olam, and the historical dynamic of ascending lights and descending vessels from generation to generation. Ibur, the Hebrew for pregnancy, impregnation or incubation, is one of the transmigration forms of the soul and is the most positive forms of possession, also the most complicated. It occurs when a righteous soul occupies a living person's body for a time and spiritually impregnates the existing soul. Yeah. So remember Ben Alaman. This could have been, Ben Alaman sounds like a Kabbalist, possibly. Ibor is always temporary, and the living person may or may not know that it has taken place. The living person may actively consent to its taking place, so as we can see, there is a great mystery attached to that. I like that teaching very much. The doctrine of metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls, is the cornerstone of all religious systems of the world. Not to mention India and Egypt, we see that it also takes place in Semitic revelation Christianity. This teaching, being very complex and difficult to reach the masses, was hidden from the crowd by most teachers and was preserved only as an esoteric among a select few. Thus, in the Gospel, we see only a few references to it, as for example in the parable of the blind man. Now we're going to have a long quote from Frank's book, Kabbalah. The transmigration of souls, according to St. Jerome, long preserved by the early Christians as a traditional esoteric doctrine, which was not to be communicated except to a small number of the elect. Abscondit quasium foves vapораrum versari, et quasi hereditario malo separim paucis. Origen sees this doctrine as the only way to explain certain biblical accounts, such as the struggle of Jacob and Esau before they were born, the calling of Jeremiah when he was still in his mother's womb, and a host of other facts that would make heaven unjust if they did not arise from the actions of good or evil in the life that preceded it. Moreover, in order to leave no doubt as to the origin and character of this belief, the Alexandrian priest finds it necessary to say that he does not here imply the metempsychosis of Plato, but a different theory, quite different and quite differently stated. And of course we've got John the Baptist, Elijah, Jesus Christ himself, a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Maybe a somewhat different case, the Son of God, but you get the idea. Among Kabbalists, the question of metempsychosis was of particular interest to Isaac Luria, as his faithful disciple Chaim Vital attests in his Et Chaim, a study on metempsychosis. The most valuable literature on this subject is the Indian one, It provides the richest, directly inexhaustible material. The doctrine of karma is the first word of esoteric science, but in its entirety it embraces all the problems of philosophy, religion, and mysticism. For this reason, I will confine myself in this place to the basic principles just explained, and its further development will be described by me on the way of interpreting the entire further chain of arcana. On the other hand, in view of the fact that there is a very extensive literature on the doctrine of karma at the present time, particularly in Russian, I consider it superfluous to repeat what has been quite satisfactorily explained by a number of authors. So he's thinking particularly of the publications of the Theosophical Society and a book called New Man by Alexei Suvorin. 50 books and pamphlets. So that was Shmakov's teaching on metempsychosis, and I've ended with a picture of the incarnations of Vishnu. From the fish becomes a turtle. Yeah, I wrote that in my poem, The Myth, which I don't think I have here. Let me just see if I can find my book, The Myth. 1 second, bear with me please. Documents. The Myth and the Nine, here we go. Now I'm trying to get my search function to work. Hang on. Because my whole poem, The Myth, is about the transition and the awakening of Orion to his previous incarnation of Osiris. I mean, this is supposed to be a comedy. Yeah, I'll read out a couple of bits from this. See as well the scales of justice, those with which the Lord Anubis weighed the souls of those departed, measured who should meet Osiris. Know they not the Queen of Starlight calls to time, stand still, be halted. So shall she perform the black rite, bring to life the king through deep night. Now Apollo speaks, your wisdom shines upon a hidden meaning. You have placed him here with reason, on the font of deeper dreaming. Might he not recall the last life, when the stars by which you've bound him shone upon Egyptian pharaohs, helped them walk the sacred night free? Queen of Egypt's floodlit delta, Isis now returns defensive. Sirius picks up the pieces before the dawn can stun his senses. Then discern the gods, goddesses, that's the one so named Orion, calls to mind his ancient history, sees the wheels of time that move on. Here's the truth, he thinks in silence. Now I comprehend my story. Memories of the tears of Isis come and thus reveal my glory. So I'm not going to read this whole thing out. It's not the bit I was looking for. Well, never mind. Sorry, that was just my little interlude. I'll stop now. When I find the bit I was looking for, I'll post it in the comments. It was about the incarnations of Vishnu. Haven't managed to memorise my own work just yet. Sorry about that. But thank you for listening.